the reason why I think he was, because look at the Trinity, for example. Look at the schisms. Now, this goes to your specialism. The idea of three all-powerful entities, that Jesus is all-powerful, that the Father is all-powerful, the Son is all-powerful, and the Holy Spirit is all-powerful, but there's not three all-powerfuls, there's one all-powerful. You have one ultimately willing being, which is a person, which is Jesus, and then another person, which is ultimately willing, which is the Son. The Quran says about this, it says, مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. In chapter 23, verse number 91, it says that Allah has not taken any son, and he did not have any creator with him. Had that been the case, they would have stripped one another for what they would have competed and tried to outstrip one another for power. Meaning this idea of three all-powerful persons is unintelligible, to say the least. The idea that Jesus Christ exhibits two natures. I know that there are schisms and there's differences of opinion among Christians, but the fact that you have this human nature where Jesus is walking and he sees the tree and he can't eat from the tree, he doesn't know that the tree is in season or not, or that he doesn't know when the hour is, or whatever it may be. The Quran says it very clearly. كَانَا يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ. Him and his mum used to eat food. This proposition that they're limited and unlimited at the same time is it's a contradiction. It's an affront to logic. This will cause you cognitive dissonance. Because if you want to be a rational actor, and you want to be...
See, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a rational actor.
But you do when you do your scientific experiments.
That's true.
So why'd you separate the two things?
Because rationality should be subordinated to something above it. And I'm trying to subordinate myself to that. And so my reaction to what you're saying is that this isn't an insult.
Yeah,
I'm telling you what my reaction is.
Please say
it's not even a criticism.
Of course.
I find that discussion, as soon as it started, I found that less interesting than what we were doing before. It was harder for me to focus on. And I think the reason for that is that it transforms to some, and I'm not saying this isn't necessary at sometimes, but it transforms the transcendent into something like an intellectual and propositional discussion. And so in some sense, we're debating perhaps not the fine points of theology, because they're more like the blunt points of theology.
I understand.
But there's something about that that isn't what I want to do with you.
Yes.
You know, and it isn't that it's not necessary. So let me flip it around to some degree. So one of the things I'm very curious about is, obviously, the figure of Christ is contentious.
Yes.
And so the Jews don't know what to make of Christ in some fundamental sense, because he seems like a continuation of the prophetic tradition in some real sense, plus he was Jewish, so that makes things complicated. And then, of course, the Christians put the figure of Christ as central in some real sense, but that begs the question of the relationship between Christ and God. And then in the Muslim community, Christ is also a central figure. And so I'm curious about that, and we could say we have doctrinal differences about what constitutes that centrality. It's like, fair enough, and I would also not say that I understand what that centrality means. So one of the ways I would understand that, let's say, is that in the Western tradition, and I don't know to what degree this is true in the Muslim tradition, one of the attributes of what Christ is psychologically is the logos. And so if we're engaged in dialogue, which is dual logos, then we're embodying the spirit of something like mutual enlightenment. And that's then the presence of that spirit in the genuine confines of temporal reality, right? It's something like the infinite descending to the finite to illuminate us. And to the degree that we can have a dialogue in good faith, which is also a religious notion, then we can engage in that process of dialogos, and that transforms and redeems us. And then when I say, well, do I believe that? I say, well, it isn't just that I believe it as a proposition. It's that I can tell when it's happening. And so can you, I think. It's like, you're going to see that this conversation will ebb and flow, you know, and some of the time it's going to grip you. You think, we're at the heart of the matter, and sometimes your attention's going to wander. Your attention's going to wander when we're off the path. And so I would say that to the degree that you and I are communicating, this is a religious way of thinking about it, is that we're doing our best to embody the spirit of the Logos. And if that's working, then we're making progress. And I know that in the Western tradition, that's part of what has been conceptualized as the fundamental attribute of the figure of Christ. And I know that Christ is central in the Muslim tradition. And so one of the things I would want to know is not how we differ doctrinally, because I don't even think I'm qualified to debate you on that case.
We've got the guy here.
Well, Jonathan might have some things to say, but what I would like to know instead is, why do you believe that the figure of Christ is central in some sense, or maybe I've got that wrong, although I don't think so. Why do you think the figure of Christ is central both to the Muslim faith and the Christian faith? And what do you think that says about what we share in common? Because I really don't understand that. It's a mystery to me.
Okay, so Jesus Christ, if secular historians will look at him and differ on his existence or not. The majority, to be fair, do believe he existed, right? Even secular historians, atheists and agnostics and whatever it may be, right?
It's the simplest explanation.
Yeah, it's a simple, of course, yeah. So I believe that, first of all, Jesus Christ existed, which in the modern age is worth noting, right? Muslims are the only other major world religion who believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as the prophet.
Right,
he had the virgin
and
birth.
this is a strange thing, so we should definitely be trying to sort that out.
All right, so this is the first point of commonality. We believe in Jesus Christ. We believe in his miracles, that he cured the blind with God's permission, that he raised the dead with God's permission. We believe that he even, he created some things which in the Gospel of Thomas not mentioned in the Bible, like, but for example, the clay bird and so on, that he blew into it and it became an actual bird, that he cured the leper with God's permission. We believe that he was one of the mightiest human beings that have ever lived on the earth. And we believe that his mother was the best woman who ever lived on the earth. The Quran actually explicitly says that.
Well, that seems like a good starting point.
Right, and so that is the first thing we believe. When we look at the Quranic verses relating to Jesus Christ, we don't look at those metaphorically. No Orthodox Muslim normatively looks at those in an eschatological way. It's not eschatology for us, it's history. So we believe that this is actually historical. That's the first thing. And the reason why I mention that to you is because I listen to all of your biblical series. I think a lot of Muslims have, and you know that right here. A lot of people like it. And because obviously...
Yeah, strangely enough.
And it's not very strange if you know the Quran, because the Quran actually tells us to go to the people of the book and to listen to them and to, and you'll find in exegesis, like for example, Tafsir ibn Kathir, like one of the staple exegesis of the Quran, they use biblical verses all the time. Let's go to the people of the book. Let's see what information they have. At-Tabari mentions what you call Israeliyat, which is basically passages from the Bible, passages from the Torah, and so on like that, from the biblical tradition and from the Torah. So it's not abnormal for Muslim people to be interested in Christian explanations. That's been going on for 1,300 years. Yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing is that because symbolism is important, and you've mentioned, for example, Egyptian symbolism. You mentioned, for example, Orisis and I don't know, Isis and all this. Not that Isis. I know he already thinks I'm a hooligan. This man's already, but the Egyptian god Isis. I have to make that very clear, and so on. Yeah. So my question would be therefore, before we talk about symbolism, because a symbol can be something. You can have a symbol and an expression of something which exists at the same time. For example, you can have something which is not metaphoric, because you can't have a metaphor and non-metaphoric. But you can have a symbol and something which doesn't exist. For example, I say that you are a symbol for Western, I don't know, whatever it is, intellectualism, yeah? Possibly. I mean, you could debate, is Jordan Peterson a symbol for Western intellectualism? Debate it. And he exists. Now, here's the point. You know that there are central doctrines to Christianity, like the crucifixion, the ascension, the resurrection, and all the above, right? These are doctrines. How do we look at these doctrines? Because the reason why I'm asking you, I think you are qualified, or at least you have some, because you did mention in your lectures that you were taking the approach of the Alexandrian school, which is like Origin of Alexander and his Jewish teacher Philo and these kinds of people, who take what you call the spiritualizing text. They spiritualize the text. They were known, the Alexandrian school was known for spiritualizing the text. And they were aberrational in that sense. And that's why one of the reasons why they were seen as heretics by all, I think all the churches, the Eastern.
I think just Origin, but the Origin said some things which are heretical, but he has massive influence on church fathers that are respected. But to your point, let's say the notion that facts have meaning, that is something that as Christians we should believe, right? God created the world with a meaningful structure, so the world lays itself out in a way that when we see it, we can see the
Exactly,
meaning.
and this is something which all types of Christians will agree with. Catholics will agree with it, Eastern Orthodox and Protestants. All of them will say you must believe in these doctrines as happening. You cannot believe in them as symbol. You cannot believe. So the reason why this actually is...
So when I hear something like that, then the question that arises for me is, what do you mean happening? And so let me just unpack that a little bit. So I did a lecture last night at the Apollo on the story of Cain and Abel.
Yes.
And one of the things that I proposed was that not only did that story happen, but it's always happening.
Yes.
It always happened. It's happening right now, and it's always going to happen into the future. And so I would say to some degree, the mere reduction of these profound stories to a historical reality is an underestimate of their truth, because they're a strange kind of truth, because they're the truth that always happened and is happening now and always will happen. So the Cain and Abel story, for example, you have a story of the eternal battle between...
You mentioned something. You said this, the problem with this such and such theory is that it doesn't have any evidence. Full stop. Categorical. All this, what you're doing now, you didn't mention that. You didn't say, well, it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what sorry to say, but it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you mean. You become postmodern all of a sudden. It's like you become now.
That's a definite. That's a definite. Yeah. Look, I think that's partly why the postmodern critique, in some sense, was inevitable, is because we started to dig down into something like, say, the meaning of stories, because that's really where the postmodernists got their impetus, because the postmodern literary theorists, sorry to drag this up, but it's relevant, they hit a mystery, which was, well, if you read a given text, story, or even a paragraph, and you get 100 people to offer their opinion on it, in some way you get 100 different opinions. And you can tell that if you assign students to write an essay, let's say. And so then a problem emerges is if there's 100 different opinions, and some of them even appear to oppose one another, how do you know what the true significance is of the text? And then worse, how do you even know that there is a true significance? And then you think, okay, well, that's a major problem. And then here's a worse problem. Imagine you have an assemblage of texts, like the biblical corpus, let's say, which is really a library, and it's in some sense canonical, right? Well, if you can't decide on the fixed meaning of even a given paragraph, how in the world can you make the statement that this selection of text, which are much more complicated than just paragraphs, is somehow canonical? Now, the answer to that is, this is the answer. We don't know. Now, the problem with the postmodernists wasn't that they figured out that this was a mystery, because not only is this the mystery of textual interpretation, which is a major mystery, how do we understand a text, but it's also the mystery of perception, because at the same time, people who are investigating perception, Jonathan has been talking about this with John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist, at the same time, scientists on the perceptual front in AI labs and neuroscientists were discovering that it's so complicated to look at the world, which is to interpret the world, let's say, that it isn't obvious that it's even possible, which is partly why we don't have autonomous robots. They can't see the world. Now, it's easy for us because we just look at it, but that's not so easy. And so, so what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is that if you delve into questions deeply enough, you do run into the problem of perception and the multitude and multiplicity of perception. And that's a real problem. And so when I do something like I interrogate a question, well, the postmodern problem does emerge. Now, I've been trying to work out solutions to that, and Jonathan and I and John Vervaeke have been discussing this a lot. The postmodernists were correct, I think, in their diagnosis of the problem. They leapt right to the idea that the way we solve the problem of perception is by exercising power. They just took a Marxist story and said, well, there's the solution.
When you say they here, who are you talking about in particular?
Mostly the French intellectual types like Derrida and Foucault.
I would disagree with this, by the way. I don't think Derrida or Foucault took a Marxist position at all.
Well, Jonathan, you want to have at that for a bit?
But that's not my fight. It's a worthless victory for me.
Are you sure you want to talk about that?
No. I don't think, I don't care.
Okay, well, we can either delve into that or not.
Yeah.
Let me just say something, Jordan, about
yeah.
what you were saying. That is, I think that when there's this question of do you believe in God, I think one of the problems that the difficulty that Jordan faced with a modern Protestantism, which was very propositional. And it was like I believe, and it's just a bunch of things that you believe in terms of thinking. And I do think that what Jordan is trying to grasp at and trying to understand is actually probably closer to something that most traditional Muslims would believe, which is that if you say that you submit to God, but you don't submit to God, then that word is empty.
That I agree with.
Yes.
The question is, why is it empty, right? Yeah. If you said the words, why is it still empty?
And so I think that what he's grasping at is to find a more encompassing, it's like, stop asking me if I believe in God, watch me.
Yeah, okay. No, but I get what you're saying. But what I'm saying is this, is that the attitude that you have towards scientific investigation is that which is more congruent with a correspondence theory type understanding,
yes.
Right? So you simply ask the question that, by the way, the Quran asks. And one of the central questions the Quran asks us to ask, Christians and Jews, is قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Bring your evidence if you're truthful. This is the central question that Muslims are asked to ask. The same question that you, as a scientist, ask, we have to ask as well, right? And I'm using the word ask a lot here. What I'm saying is, this is where the cognitive dissonance may come in. I'm not saying
it does come in.
So
that is part of what's torn the West apart on the basis of the Enlightenment versus the religious tradition, to the degree that that's a conflict.
Just to add to this point is, for example, going back to Origin of Alexandria, yeah? Origin of Alexandria, because he has this hermeneutical dilemma. He has a hermeneutical dilemma, right? He doesn't know what to do with what verse. Is he going to spiritualize it, metaphorize it, or is he not going to do that? He was asked by an apologist called Celsus. He said, what do you say of the crucifixion? And he responds to an effect to say that not everything was true, what happened, right, in the crucifixion. Point is that when you open the can of worms of hermeneutical spiritualization or exegetical or, metaphorization, yeah? When you open that can of worms, what is left of Christianity is basically mythological. Now, then I will say, what makes this myth better than any other myth? Why are we investigating the myth of Christianity and not, for example, the myth of Hercules and Zeus? Why is the figure of Father and Son and Holy Spirit more important to me than the Mithraic, Trinity?
Yeah, well, that's a postmodern question. And you could take that even farther and say, well, why this story rather than that story at any level of story? And that is a central question.
So how would you answer? Because why did you, if, for example, you've done a biblical lecture, right?
Yeah.
So why have you done a biblical lecture, not a lecture on Zeus and this and all these other...
Well, I have done lectures on other religious structures, particularly on ancient Egyptian cosmology and on Mesopotamian cosmology. And I'm going to do a lecture on the Tao Te Ching.
Sorry, do you consider the biblical narrative as having any level of superiority over the other mythologies?
Well, okay. So let me try to address this psychologically.
Oh, even he's interested now.
Well, yeah, because I am a Christian.
So I've been trying to understand. So I'll tell you one thing that clinical psychologists have learned over the last 100 years, despite their doctrinal differences. So there's many schools of clinical psychology, ranging from behaviorism, which is very practical and strategic, and has to do with micro changes in action, to psychoanalytic theory, say on the Jungian side, which is more interested in dreams and large-scale transformations of the imagination. Spans a huge range of philosophies and practical approaches. But there is one commonality, and it's emerged, I would say, empirically. The behaviorists discovered that if someone was afraid of something and avoiding it, and the combination of those two things are important, because there's lots of things you should be afraid of that you should avoid, like playing in traffic, because you'll just die if you go run out in the street. But imagine that you're moving towards a necessary goal and you're pretty committed to it, and something comes up that you're afraid of and it stops you, and now you start to avoid. Okay, and then maybe that gives you an anxiety disorder, it makes you depressed. Then the question is, what are you avoiding and why, and what should you do about it? And what the behaviorists started to do was to expose people to small doses of what they were afraid of and get them to relax. And the idea was, well, if you could learn to relax in the face of what you were afraid of, then the fear would go away. And maybe you had learned in some way to associate that with anxiety earlier. Now, it turned out that that worked, but it also turned out that it worked even if you didn't relax. And so there wasn't a learning to be calm. And then the psychoanalyst said, now that's not going to work, behaviorists, because you'll expose someone to this little fear, and because the true fear is much deeper, the fear will just reemerge somewhere else. They called that symptom substitution. And that didn't happen either, because what happened, weirdly enough, was that if you got someone to confront something they were afraid of voluntarily, then they got less afraid, that was the first theory, less afraid of a whole bunch of things. So a little courage generated more, and that's a more accurate way of thinking about it. Turns out people didn't get less afraid. They got braver. And so their personality started to expand. And so what you see often, one category of people who often develop anxiety disorders are dependent women. And so those are women who've gone from sort of superordinate man to superordinate man, who've never established a sufficient individual identity, and maybe that comes back to haunt them later in life, and they develop an anxiety disorder, and maybe they're afraid to get into an elevator. So you can teach them to confront the elevator and to get in it and to take it, and then they'll go home and have a fight with their husband. And it's because they're braver, and often the husband and the rest of the family will resist this woman's attempt to become more courageous because they know what's going to happen if it's successful. But that is what you see, is you see generalization of bravery. And every psychological school knows this. Okay, so now you asked me a theological question, so I'm going to address that. So I've been trying to understand from a psychological perspective, for example, why people have been gazing on the figure of the crucifix for 2,000 years. Now, not everyone, and doctrinal differences apart, it's still many people for 2,000 years, and that begs a question. Obviously, there's something about that image that's gripping. Okay, so now you might think, why? Well, why do people go to horror movies? Because that's pretty strange. Why in the world would you go be disgusted and terrified? Because that's sort of the essence of horror. And the answer is, because there are terrifying and disgusting things about life. And maybe you should go confront them now and then voluntarily, so you get a little taste, so you can build a little courage and a little faith. And so at minimum, one of the things that the crucifixion story, the passion story represents is something like the sum of all possible tragedy. And so Jung pointed out that the passion narrative was an archetypal tragedy. And this is what he meant by that. Imagine that you took a bunch of stories that were tragic. And so you could identify them all as tragic stories. And a tragic story is something like something terrible happens to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's a tragedy. So then imagine you have 10 stories about maybe someone got betrayed by his best friend and someone fall prey to a tyranny, and someone died young and someone innocent was punished by a court, and you'd think, oh, that's tragic. And then you took all those tragedies and you took the core of the tragedy and you made it into one story. And that's, in some sense, what the passion story is. It's the sum of all possible tragedies insofar as that can be construed by the revelatory imagination.